letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, and by the time Eleanor Whitmore finished reading it, her hands were shaking so badly she had to set it down on the kitchen table. Her father was dying. Not next year, not in a few months, but soon, the doctor had written, unless she could find a way to pay for the treatment that might save him. £300. She did not have £3, let alone 300. She sat in the small, cold kitchen of their rented rooms in London and stared at the letter until the words blurred together. Outside, the rain kept falling, tapping against the window like it was counting down the hours she had left to think of something. Anything. That evening, a carriage stopped outside her door. Eleanor had never seen anything so fine parked on her narrow street before, and she watched from behind the curtain as a tall man in a dark coat stepped down and knocked. She opened the door expecting a mistake, a wrong address, but the man asked for her by name. His name was Julian Ashford, and until 3 weeks earlier, he had been plain Julian Ashford, second son of a minor lord, with no expectation of ever inheriting anything grand. Then his elder brother had died suddenly, and their father soon after, and Julian had found himself the Duke of Camden almost overnight, inheriting not just a title, but a mountain of family debt, and a scandal that threatened to follow him into every drawing room in England. His late brother had left behind gambling debts so large that half the estate would need to be sold unless something changed quickly, and the solicitors had told him plainly that a marriage, a proper marriage with the right kind of quiet dignity behind it, would settle the nerves of the family's creditors and give the new duke the appearance of stability he desperately needed. He did not want a wife who would ask questions. He did not want a wife who expected romance, or affection, or any of the things he no longer believed in, after watching his brother destroy their family from the inside. He wanted someone practical. Someone who understood that this was an arrangement, not a courtship. A mutual acquaintance, a lawyer who had once helped Eleanor's father with a small business matter, had mentioned her name. A respectable young woman, hard-working, quiet, from a family fallen on hard times. No scandal attached to her. No family fortune to complicate things. Julian had not even met her before he decided she would do. Standing in her doorway that evening, he did not offer flowers or kind words. He offered a proposal, spoken as plainly as a business contract, because that was exactly what it was meant to be. "I am prepared to settle your father's medical expenses in full," he said, "and provide a generous allowance for the remainder of his life, if you agree to marry me within the month." Eleanor stood very still. She thought of her father, asleep upstairs, his breathing rough and uneven, even in sleep. She thought of the letter on the kitchen table, the doctor's careful, hopeless handwriting. She thought of the years she had spent sewing dresses late into the night to keep food on their table, and the other promise she carried, one this stranger knew nothing about, one she had made years ago and never once broken. "I accept," she said. Julian looked faintly surprised at how quickly she answered, though he covered it well. He had expected hesitation, perhaps tears, perhaps questions about affection, or the future. Instead he got a calm, steady voice, and a woman who did not even ask what he looked like in daylight, before agreeing to spend her life beside him. It confirmed something in his mind, something he had already decided before he ever knocked on her door. She wanted the money. She wanted the security. Of course she did. Everyone did. He did not consider, even for a moment, that a woman might have reasons of her own that had nothing to do with him at all. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in a small chapel, with only a handful of witnesses. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself, careful and plain, because there had been no time and no desire for anything grander. Julian wore his family's old ring, the one that had passed through generations of Ashford dukes, and placed it on her finger without ceremony, without warmth, the way a man signs a document he has already read twice and has no further questions about. Her father was too weak to attend, but the money had already reached his doctor, and for the first time in months, Eleanor allowed herself to believe he might actually recover. That belief, more than anything Julian said to her that day, was what carried her through the vows. Afterward, in the carriage taking them to Camden Hall, Julian studied his new wife across the seat. She was pretty in a quiet way, not the kind of beauty that turned heads in ballrooms, but something steadier, something that did not fade under attention. She kept her hands folded in her lap and looked out the window at the passing countryside, and she did not try to fill the silence with nervous conversation the way he had expected. "You understand what this marriage is," he said finally. Not quite a question. I understand, Eleanor answered, still looking out the window. I will not pretend to feelings I do not have, Julian continued, his voice careful and cool. You will have a comfortable life, a title, security your father's health has already benefited from. In return, I expect discretion, and I expect you to perform the duties expected of a duchess. Nothing more. Eleanor turned to look at him then, and something in her steady gaze made him feel, for just a moment, oddly exposed, as though she could see straight through the careful speech he had clearly rehearsed. I understand the arrangement, Your Grace, she said simply. You need not explain it twice. He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the window himself, missing entirely the flicker of something else in her expression, something that was not greed, and was not calculation, but looked, if he had cared to notice, almost like grief. Camden Hall rose out of the countryside like something from a story Eleanor had never expected to live inside. Gray stone walls, tall windows catching the last of the evening light, gardens stretching further than she could see from the carriage window. She had grown up in 2 rented rooms above a bakery, sharing a single fireplace with her father and, until 4 years ago, with her younger brother. The size of the house alone made her chest tighten. The staff lined up to greet them, and Eleanor felt every eye on her, assessing, measuring, wondering how a seamstress's daughter had managed to catch a duke. She kept her back straight and her expression calm, the same way she had learned to do years ago, when neighbors whispered about her family's troubles. Whatever they thought of her, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing it land. The housekeeper, a warm-faced woman named Margaret Doyle, showed her to her rooms that evening. They were the finest Eleanor had ever seen, a bed with more pillows than she had owned blankets, a wardrobe standing empty and waiting to be filled with dresses she could not yet imagine wearing. His Grace's rooms are just through that door, Margaret said carefully, watching Eleanor's face for a reaction. Though I understand he keeps to his study most evenings. Eleanor only nodded, and Margaret, sensing there was more beneath the young duchess's calm exterior than she was letting on, did not press further. She simply lit the fire and left Eleanor alone with the enormous quiet of her new home. That night, Eleanor sat by the window long after the house had gone dark, a single candle burning beside her, and took out a small, worn notebook she had carried with her since she was 16 years old. Inside were careful columns of numbers, money set aside, money spent, dates and amounts stretching back years. She added a new line at the bottom, the first payment from her new allowance, already earmarked before it had even arrived in full. She thought of her brother, 4 years younger than her, living now in a quiet house, 2 counties away, cared for by people who understood him in ways their own mother, in her shame and grief, never had. She thought of the promise she had made at her mother's bedside, whispered through tears neither of them tried to hide. Whatever happens to me, you will not let him be forgotten. You will not let them lock him away and call it kindness. You will keep him safe, and you will keep him close in your heart, even when the world tells you to look away. Eleanor had kept that promise every single day since, through years of exhausting work, through hunger she never spoke of to anyone, through a marriage she had entered not for a title, not for silk dresses or grand houses, but because it was the only door left open that could keep her promise alive. Julian believed she had married him for his name. He believed she was like every other woman who had smiled at him since his brother's death, calculating what his new position might mean for her own comfort. He had no idea that the woman now sleeping under his roof carried a secret so carefully guarded that not even her own father fully understood the sacrifices she had made to protect it. Downstairs, in his study, Julian poured himself a drink and told himself the arrangement had gone exactly as planned. A quiet wife, no complications, no feelings to manage. He had gotten precisely what he wanted. He did not yet know how wrong he was. The first weeks at Camden Hall settled into a routine that felt less like a marriage and more like 2 strangers sharing an address. Julian left early for meetings with solicitors and estate managers, buried in the tangled finances his brother had left behind, and returned late, often after Eleanor had already retired for the night. They dined together perhaps twice a week, and even then, the conversation rarely stretched beyond the weather or the state of the roads. Eleanor did not complain. She had not married for companionship, and she told herself, firmly, that she should feel grateful rather than lonely. Still, the size of the house pressed in on her in ways she had not expected. Rooms echoed. Hallways stretched on longer than seemed reasonable. She found herself missing the cramped warmth of her old rooms above the bakery, where she could hear her father's footsteps through the thin walls, and always knew she was not truly alone. The staff, at first, were unsure what to make of her. A duchess who mended her own torn hem, rather than ringing for a maid. A duchess who thanked the kitchen staff by name and remembered which of the younger servants had a sister recovering from illness. It did not match what most of them had expected from a woman rumored to have married a duke for his fortune. Margaret Doyle, the housekeeper, was the first to soften toward her. She found Eleanor one afternoon, sitting in the small sewing room off the east wing, mending a torn curtain with quick, practiced stitches, instead of sending for the seamstress on staff. "You needn't do that yourself, Your Grace," Margaret said gently. "I know," Eleanor answered, not looking up from her work. "But I've done it my whole life. It feels strange to stop simply because I'm allowed to." Margaret smiled at that, a real smile. And from that day on, she made a point of checking in on the young duchess whenever her duties allowed, bringing tea she did not ask for, and news of the household she thought might interest her. Not everyone was so kind. Charles Vane, Julian's cousin and closest living relative besides his mother, made his opinion of the marriage known within days of Eleanor's arrival. He was a tall, sharp-featured man with an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes, and he had spent the years since Julian's brother's death quietly positioning himself as the family's most reliable member, the one who understood duty and reputation in ways the reckless late heir never had. He had also, though few knew it, been counting on inheriting a portion of the estate himself if Julian failed to produce an heir or fell into scandal severe enough to force him out. A sudden, convenient marriage to an unknown seamstress's daughter did not fit neatly into his plans. "You must forgive my curiosity," Charles said to Eleanor one evening, cornering her in the drawing room while Julian was occupied elsewhere. "But it is rather remarkable, is it not, how quickly you and my cousin came to an understanding? Love at first sight, was it?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. She had grown up around people who smiled while they insulted you, who wrapped cruelty in polite phrasing, and expected you to be too well-mannered to call it what it was. "There was no need for love, Mr. Vane," she said calmly. "Only honesty. I imagine you understand the difference, given how carefully you choose your own words." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of respect, though it was quickly smoothed away into his usual practiced smile. "Careful, Your Grace," he said softly, before excusing himself. "This family has swallowed sharper tongues than yours before." Eleanor did not tell Julian about the exchange. She did not think he would care to hear it, and some instinct told her that whatever tension existed between the two men was old and complicated, not something a new arrival should stir further. It was a rainy evening, nearly a month into her marriage, when the first real crack appeared in the careful distance Julian had built between them. Eleanor was returning from the kitchens, having gone down herself to request a warm drink for a young kitchen maid who had come down with a fever, when she heard a commotion near the servants' quarters. A small boy, no older than 6, the son of one of the cooks, was crying in his mother's arms, his face flushed and his breathing shallow. "He's burning up something fierce," the cook said, panic clear in her voice. "The doctor's 2 hours away in this weather, and I don't know what else to do." Eleanor did not hesitate. She had spent years nursing her own father through illnesses no doctor had time for, learning through trial and long nights exactly what eased a fever and what made it worse. She sent one servant for cool water and clean cloths, another to fetch what herbs the kitchen kept for cooking that might also ease a child's stomach, and she herself sat with the boy through the night, sponging his forehead, murmuring quiet reassurances, refusing every offer to relieve her even as the hours stretched past midnight and then past 2 in the morning. Julian found her there just before dawn, still sitting beside the child's small bed, her dress creased and her hair coming loose from its pins, humming something low and steady while the boy slept peacefully at last, his fever finally broken. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him. "You should have sent for me," he said, though even as he spoke, he was not entirely certain why it mattered, or why he had come looking for her at all, when Margaret mentioned she had not returned to her rooms. Eleanor looked up at him, exhaustion plain on her face but her voice steady all the same. "There was nothing you could have done that I could not, Your Grace, and I did not think you would wish to be disturbed over a servant's child." Something about the way she said it, plain and matter-of-fact, without a trace of the reproach he half expected, unsettled him more than an accusation would have. He had assumed, without ever quite examining the assumption, that his new wife's kindness toward the staff was simply good manners, the sort of performance expected of a woman in her position. But there was no audience here. No one to impress with her devotion at 3 in the morning, beside a sick child who would never be able to advance her socially or thank her publicly for the effort. "You're exhausted," he said instead, unable to find the right words for what he actually wanted to ask. "I've stayed up later for less," Eleanor answered simply, and something in her tone made him wonder, for the first time, what exactly her life had looked like before he arrived at her door with his cold, practical proposal. He offered his arm to help her stand, an oddly formal gesture given the circumstances, and she took it without comment, too tired to consider it strange. They walked back through the quiet sleeping house together, and for the length of that walk, neither of them spoke of duty, or arrangements, or the careful distance they had both worked so hard to maintain. "Thank you," Julian said finally, as they reached the top of the stairs, "for what you did tonight." Eleanor paused, surprised by the sincerity in his voice, so different from the cool, contractual tone he usually reserved for her. "You needn't thank me," she said. "I wasn't doing it for you." She meant it as simple honesty, an explanation rather than a rebuke, but Julian felt the words land somewhere he had not expected, a small crack in the certainty he had carried since their wedding day. He had believed, without ever truly questioning it, that every kindness his wife showed was calculated, that beneath her quiet composure lay the same ambition he had seen in every other woman who had smiled at him since he became a duke. But ambition did not explain a woman sitting up all night with a servant's sick child, asking nothing in return, expecting no one to even notice. He said nothing further that night, retreating to his own rooms, with more questions than he had carried in weeks. And though he did not yet know it, that quiet moment on the stairs, more than any vow spoken in the chapel, marked the true beginning of his marriage. In the days that followed, Julian found himself watching his wife more closely than he intended to. He noticed the way she wrote careful letters at her writing desk each week, always sealing them herself before handing them to a groom for posting, never explaining who they were for. He noticed that she rarely spent money on herself, choosing to alter her existing dresses rather than order new ones, despite the generous allowance now available to her. He noticed, too, the way her expression sometimes grew distant and sad when she thought no one was watching, a shadow crossing her face that vanished the instant anyone spoke to her. He told himself it was simply curiosity, the natural interest a man might take in understanding the woman sharing his home. He did not yet let himself consider that it might be something more. Charles Vane noticed the shift as well, and he did not like it. A duke too preoccupied with his convenient bride was a duke less focused on protecting the family's fragile finances and less inclined to lean on his cousin's careful guidance the way he had in the weeks following his brother's death. Charles began, quietly and carefully, to ask his own questions about the new Duchess, starting with the mysterious weekly letters no one in the household seemed able to explain. It would take time for what he uncovered to surface, but the seeds of suspicion, once planted, rarely stayed buried for long in a house as full of watching eyes as Camden Hall. 3 weeks after the night of the fever, Julian returned from a long day of meetings with the estate's solicitors, his temper worn thin from hours spent untangling debts his brother had left scattered across half the banks in London. He wanted nothing more than a quiet evening and a strong drink, but as he passed Eleanor's sitting room, he noticed the door standing slightly open and a small wooden writing box sitting on the table inside, its lid unlocked for once. He told himself, later, that he had not meant to look, that he had simply noticed the box was open and thought to close it, out of habit, the same way he might close any door left ajar in his own house. But his hand lingered on the lid a moment too long, and before he fully decided to do it, he had lifted it and found himself looking down at a neat bundle of letters, tied together with plain string, every one addressed in Eleanor's careful handwriting to the same name. Edwin. Not a name he recognized. Not a servant, not a relative she had ever mentioned, not anyone who had been introduced to him in the months since their wedding. He stood there far longer than he should have, staring at that single word written over and over across a dozen envelopes, each one dated weeks apart, stretching back further than their marriage itself. He untied the string before he could stop himself, And though every instinct told him a gentleman did not read another person's private correspondence, a colder, more suspicious part of him, the part shaped by years of watching his own brother lie so smoothly that even their father had believed him, took over instead. The letters were careful, guarded, written the way a person writes when they know their words might be read by someone other than the intended recipient. My dearest Edwin, I think of you every day and count the hours until I can visit again. I have arranged for more funds to be sent to Dr. Cole this month, and I hope it eases things for you. Please know that whatever else changes in my life, this will never change. You are never far from my thoughts. Julian read 3 of them before he made himself stop, his jaw tight, his chest strangely hollow. There was no explicit declaration of romance in the careful phrases, but there did not need to be. A woman writing secret letters to an unnamed man, sending money to someone called Dr. Cole without her husband's knowledge, keeping the entire arrangement locked away and hidden from him for months. It painted a picture clear enough for any reasonable man to understand, and Julian, exhausted and already primed by a lifetime of family betrayal to expect the worst from the people closest to him, did not look for another explanation. He retied the letters exactly as he had found them, closed the box, and left the room before Eleanor returned from wherever she had gone that afternoon. But something in him had already shifted, hardening back into the cold, guarded distance he had maintained in the earliest days of their marriage, the distance he had let slip since the night of the fever. Eleanor noticed the change immediately when she saw him at dinner that evening. His warmth, the careful attentiveness that had grown between them over the past weeks, had vanished entirely, replaced by the clipped, formal politeness he had shown her on their wedding day. "Is something troubling you, Your Grace?" she asked, setting down her fork. "Nothing that concerns you," Julian answered, not looking up from his plate. She frowned slightly, but did not press further, assuming perhaps that the estate's finances had brought some new difficulty, or that Charles had said something to sour his mood again. She had no way of knowing that a locked box she thought entirely private had already been opened, its careful secrets misread and twisted into something they were never meant to be. Over the following days, Julian withdrew further, spending even longer hours away from the house, and when he was home, he watched Eleanor with a coldness that confused and hurt her, though she could not understand its cause. She wrote it off, at first, as the ordinary strain of managing a difficult inheritance, but the distance grew sharper with each passing day, until even Margaret Doyle noticed the tension settling back over the household like a fog that would not lift. Charles Vane noticed it too, and saw in it exactly the opportunity he had been quietly waiting for. He had already made a few careful inquiries of his own, paying a discreet visit to a clerk who handled the household's correspondence, learning that the Duchess sent regular payments each month to a Dr. Nathaniel Cole, whose name Charles did not recognize from any of the family's usual physicians. It was not difficult after that to plant a seed of doubt where one had already begun to grow on its own. "I only mention it," Charles said one evening, finding Julian alone in his study with a drink he had barely touched, "because I would hate to see you humiliated the way your brother so often humiliated this family. A wife with secrets is a dangerous thing, cousin, particularly a wife the family knows nothing about." "What are you suggesting?" Julian asked, though the tightness in his own chest told him he already suspected the answer. "Only that it might be worth understanding exactly who this Dr. Cole is, and why your Duchess sends him money every month without ever mentioning it to you," Charles said mildly, watching his cousin's face carefully for a reaction. "I imagine there is an innocent explanation. There usually is not, in my experience. But I do hope for your sake that I am wrong." He left without waiting for a response, satisfied that he had done exactly what he intended. Julian sat alone long after Charles departed, staring into the fire, the careful, guarded phrases from Eleanor's letters circling through his mind, alongside his cousin's careful insinuations. He told himself he was being unreasonable. He told himself Eleanor had given him no real reason for such suspicion, beyond a locked box he had no business opening in the first place. But the doubt had already taken root, feeding on old wounds his own family had left behind, and Julian found himself, despite every rational objection, believing the worst far more easily than he believed the best. The following evening, matters came to a head over what began as an ordinary dinner. Eleanor mentioned, in passing, that she would need to travel 2 counties over the following week for what she called a personal matter, offering no further explanation. It was not the first such trip she had made since their marriage, though it was the first time Julian had asked directly what the visit concerned. "A personal matter," he repeated, his voice carefully flat. "Would this personal matter happen to involve a Dr. Cole?" Eleanor went very still, her fork pausing halfway to her plate. "How do you know that name?" "Does it matter how I know it?" Julian asked, setting down his own utensils with more force than necessary. "I would rather know why my wife has been sending money to a man I've never met, writing him letters she keeps locked away, and traveling to see him without ever once explaining herself to me." Color drained from Eleanor's face, replaced almost immediately by a flash of anger sharper than anything Julian had seen from her before. "You read my letters." "I closed a box left open in my own house," Julian said, though even as the words left his mouth, he heard how thin the excuse sounded. "And found something I think any husband would have questions about." "You had no right," Eleanor said, her voice trembling now, though whether from anger or something closer to grief, Julian could not tell. "Whatever you think you understood from 3 careful letters, you understood nothing at all." "Then explain it to me," Julian said, leaning forward. "Explain Edwin. Explain Dr. Cole. Explain why my wife has kept an entire secret life hidden from me, since the day we married, if there is truly nothing here worth questioning." Eleanor's hands were shaking now, gripping the edge of the table hard enough that her knuckles had gone white. For one long moment, Julian thought she might actually tell him, might finally break through the careful composure she had maintained since the day they met. Instead, she stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger, and not quite sorrow, but something painfully close to both. "Some things are not mine to explain, Your Grace," she said quietly. "Not even to you. I ask only that you trust me, though I understand now that you never truly have, not from the very beginning." She left the room before he could answer, and Julian sat alone at the long, silent table, his suspicions no clearer than before, but the distance between them now wider than it had ever been since their wedding day. He told himself he had every right to his doubts. He told himself a husband deserved honesty from his wife, and yet, some small, uneasy part of him could not stop replaying the look on her face as she left the room. A look that had nothing in it of a woman caught in deception, and everything in it of a woman protecting something she could not bear to lose. He did not yet understand what that something was, but the careful walls Eleanor had built around her oldest promise were beginning to crack under the weight of a suspicion she had never expected to face, and it would not be long now before the truth found its way into the light, whether either of them was ready for it or not. For 2 days after the argument, Julian and Eleanor did not speak beyond the barest necessities. Meals passed in silence, broken only by the clink of silverware, and Eleanor kept to the sewing room, or her private sitting room, whenever Julian was in the house, as though the walls of Camden Hall had grown too small to hold them both comfortably. Margaret Doyle noticed the change at once, and unlike Charles Vane, she did not need careful inquiries to guess at its cause. She had overheard enough of the household's whispers, and had known Eleanor long enough now to recognize genuine distress when she saw it. Not the calculated performance of a woman caught in some scheme, but the quiet grief of someone misunderstood by the one person she had perhaps begun, cautiously, to hope might understand her after all. "You look as though you haven't slept," Margaret said gently, finding Eleanor at her writing desk late one evening, a fresh letter half finished before her, the ink already dry where she had stopped writing to simply stare out the window instead. "I haven't, not really," Eleanor admitted, too tired to maintain her usual careful composure in front of the one member of the household she had come to trust. Margaret set down the tray of tea she had brought and settled into the chair across from her without waiting to be invited, an informality she would never have risked in the early weeks of Eleanor's arrival, but one that felt necessary now. "Whatever it is that troubles you," Margaret said carefully, "I think you ought to consider that trusting him might serve you better than protecting him from the truth. His Grace is not a cruel man, whatever coldness he wears like armor. I have known him since he was a boy visiting this house as a second son, with no expectation of ever inheriting it. He learned distrust the hard way, watching his own brother lie to everyone who loved him. That does not excuse his suspicion of you, but it might explain it." Eleanor turned the words over carefully, staring down at her unfinished letter. "It is not a matter of trusting him with a secret about myself, Margaret. It is a matter of trusting him with someone else's safety, Someone who has already been hurt enough by people who could not understand him, and who does not deserve to become gossip in a house full of servants and cousins looking for any excuse to think less of him. Margaret did not press for details, sensing she had already been given more than Eleanor had intended to share, but she reached over and squeezed the younger woman's hand all the same. Then perhaps it is time you decided whether protecting that secret is worth the cost of losing whatever chance you and His Grace might have at something real. I have watched him with you these past weeks, before all this trouble began. I do not think his coldness now comes from indifference, Your Grace. I think it comes from fear of being made a fool of again, the way his brother made fools of this entire family for years. That is a different thing entirely, and one that might yet be mended. Eleanor said nothing further that night, but Margaret's words stayed with her long after the housekeeper had gone, turning over and over in her mind, alongside the memory of Julian's face across the dinner table, hurt and suspicious, and, underneath it all, something that had looked almost like desperation for an explanation she had refused to give him. Julian, meanwhile, found himself no closer to peace than his wife. He had thrown himself back into estate business, with a ferocity that left even his most patient solicitors exhausted, using the work as a shield against thoughts he did not want to examine too closely. But late at night, alone in his study, the doubts crept back regardless, tangled now with something he recognized, uncomfortably, as guilt. He kept remembering the look on Eleanor's face as she left the dinner table, not the look of a woman caught in an affair, flustered and searching for excuses. Something steadier than that, something that had held its ground even while her voice shook, as though whatever she was protecting mattered more to her than his good opinion, more than the comfort of their marriage, more perhaps than anything else in her life. That was not how guilty people behaved, not in his experience. His brother had lied smoothly, easily, always with a ready explanation and a charming smile to smooth over suspicion. Eleanor had offered him nothing but silence, and a request for trust she must have known he was not prepared to give. He found himself, against his better judgment, seeking out Charles again, not for further insinuation this time, but almost hoping his cousin might offer some reason to doubt his own doubts. "Have you learned anything further about this Dr. Cole?" Julian asked, finding Charles in the library one afternoon, a glass of brandy already in hand despite the early hour. "Only that he runs a private residence for individuals requiring specialized care," Charles said, watching Julian's reaction carefully. "The sort of place families send relatives they would rather the world not discuss too openly. Illness of the mind, typically, or conditions that make a person unsuitable for ordinary society." Julian felt something cold settle in his stomach, though he could not have said exactly why. "And you believe my wife visits such a place for what purpose?" Charles shrugged, the picture of careless disinterest, though Julian did not miss the calculation behind his cousin's eyes. "I could not say for certain. Perhaps a former lover, driven mad by her abandonment of him for a more advantageous match. Perhaps something else entirely. I only think it strange, cousin, that a woman would keep such visits secret if there were nothing shameful attached to them." The suggestion of a former lover, mad with heartbreak, struck Julian harder than he expected, conjuring an image uncomfortably close to his own family's troubled history, his brother's chaotic entanglements that had so often ended in scandal and ruin. He left the library without finishing the conversation, more unsettled than when he had entered it. That evening, unable to bear the silence stretching between them any longer, Julian found Eleanor in the small sewing room, mending yet another torn hem by candlelight, though she could easily have summoned a servant to do it for her. "I owe you an apology," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway, the words unfamiliar and difficult after so many years of guarding himself against exactly this kind of vulnerability, "for reading letters that were not mine to read. Whatever explanation you have or do not have, I should not have gone looking for it the way I did." Eleanor looked up from her stitching, surprised by the admission, though the caution in her expression did not fully fade. "Thank you for saying so. But I will not pretend the questions have gone away simply because I regret how I found the answers I was looking for," Julian continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes despite the discomfort of it. "I am asking you now, honestly, and without the excuse of a locked box left carelessly open. Who is Edwin, Eleanor? And why does it frighten you so much to tell me?" Eleanor set down her needle, her hands finally still in her lap, and studied her husband for a long moment, weighing something Julian could not quite read in her expression. The candlelight flickered between them, and outside, The wind picked up against the windows, the first hint of a storm gathering somewhere beyond the walls of Camden Hall. "It does not frighten me to tell you who he is," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "It frightens me to imagine what this family, what this world, might do to him if they knew. I have spent my entire life protecting him from exactly that kind of judgment, Your Grace, and I am not yet certain you have earned the right to be trusted with something so easily broken." Julian absorbed the words without flinching, though they landed with more weight than he expected. "Then tell me what I must do to earn that trust, because I find, against every instinct I have spent years cultivating, that I would very much like to have it." For the first time since the argument began, something in Eleanor's guarded expression softened, though she did not yet offer him the answer he was seeking. "Give me a few more days," she said quietly. "There is someone I must speak with first, someone whose comfort matters more to me than settling this quickly for your peace of mind or mine. After that, Your Grace, I promise you will have your answer." Julian nodded, though the waiting cost him more than he expected it to. He left her to her mending, but as he walked back through the quiet halls of his own house, he found himself thinking, for the first time since reading those careful letters, not of his own wounded suspicion, but of the woman he had married, and the quiet strength it must have taken her to carry a secret this heavy, for so many years, entirely alone. Whatever waited at the end of her promised explanation, he understood now that it would change everything he thought he knew about the arrangement he had entered so coldly, so many months before. 3 days later, Eleanor traveled alone to the quiet house 2 counties away, where Dr. Nathaniel Cole cared for a small number of residents whose families had chosen, for reasons of shame or simple confusion, to keep them away from the wider world. She had made this journey more times than she could count over the years, but never before with quite this same tangle of nerves sitting heavy in her chest. The house itself was modest but well kept, surrounded by gardens that Edwin had helped tend since he first arrived, planting rows of vegetables with the same careful patience he brought to everything he did. Dr. Cole met her at the door himself, a kind-faced man in his 50s, who had devoted his career to exactly the sort of care most physicians dismissed as hopeless or unworthy of serious attention. "He's been asking about you," Dr. Cole said, leading her through the entrance hall. "Counting the days since your last visit, same as always." Eleanor found her brother in the garden, kneeling beside a row of young carrots, his sleeves rolled up despite the cool afternoon air, entirely absorbed in his work. Edwin was 22 now, though something in his open, unguarded expression made him seem younger, a gentleness about him that had never learned to harden itself against the world the way Eleanor's own had been forced to. "Ellie," he said, looking up and breaking into a wide smile the moment he saw her, using the childhood name he had called her since before either of them could remember using anything else. He got to his feet and embraced her without hesitation, the way he always did, holding on a moment longer than most people might, and Eleanor let herself sink into it, some of the tension she had carried for days finally easing in her brother's simple, uncomplicated joy at seeing her. "I've missed you," she said, pulling back to look at him properly. "Have you been eating enough? Dr. Cole says you've been spending every spare hour out here in the garden." "The carrots need me," Edwin said seriously, as though this were the most obvious explanation in the world, and Eleanor laughed despite herself, a real laugh, the first she had managed in days. They walked together through the garden while she caught him up on small pieces of her new life, careful about how much she revealed, though Edwin, in his own way, understood far more than most people gave him credit for. He listened with genuine interest as she described the size of Camden Hall, the gardens larger than anything he had ever seen, the kindness of a housekeeper named Margaret who reminded her, in some ways, of their own mother in her better years. "Is he kind to you?" Edwin asked eventually, his directness catching her off guard, the way it often did. "Your husband, the Duke." Eleanor hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "He is trying to be, I think, though it hasn't been simple between us. Does he know about me?" The question landed with more weight than Edwin likely intended, and Eleanor found herself sitting down on the low stone bench beside the garden path, gathering her thoughts before she answered. "Not yet," she admitted. "He found some of my letters, and now he suspects something, though he doesn't understand what. I came here today partly to see you, and partly to decide whether I'm ready to tell him the truth." Edwin sat beside her, his brow furrowed in the careful, deliberate way he considered things that mattered to him. You've always said Mother made you promise to keep me safe. Does telling him mean I won't be safe anymore? It was, Eleanor realized, exactly the right question, cutting straight through every careful worry she had been turning over in her mind for days. I don't know, she admitted honestly, because she had promised him, always, that she would never lie to him, not even to spare either of them discomfort. But I've begun to wonder whether keeping you hidden forever is truly what safety looks like, or whether it's simply what fear has always told me safety looks like. Mother was afraid, Edwin. She grew up watching families lock relatives like you away and pretend they never existed, and she couldn't bear the thought of that happening to you. But her fear isn't the same as truth, and I think, somewhere along the way, I let her fear become mine as well, without ever questioning whether it still fit the world we live in now. Edwin considered this with the same careful attention he gave everything, his fingers absently tracing the pattern of a nearby leaf. I like it here, he said finally. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to meet more people. Real people, not just the ones Dr. Cole brings around for visits. I'm not ashamed of who I am, Ellie, even if some people might be, if they met me. His words struck her harder than anything Charles Vane's careful cruelty or Julian's cold suspicion had managed over the past difficult weeks. She had spent so many years protecting her brother from a world she assumed would only ever hurt him, that she had never quite stopped to ask him what he actually wanted for himself, beyond the safety of these familiar garden walls. I'm proud of who you are, she said, taking his hand. I always have been. I think perhaps it's time I stopped being so afraid of what other people might think, and started trusting that the people who truly matter will see you the way I do. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, and by the time Eleanor rose to make her return journey, something in her had settled, a decision made not out of desperation or cornered necessity, but out of something closer to hope. Dr. Cole walked her to her carriage as the afternoon light began to fade. He's grown a great deal these past few years, he said quietly, more confident, more willing to speak his own mind about what he wants for his life. I think, when the time is right, he would do well with more connection to the world than we've allowed him here, careful as we've had to be. I think you're right, Eleanor said, surprising herself with how easily the agreement came. I think it's time I stopped deciding what's best for him out of fear, and started asking him instead. The journey back to Camden Hall felt different from every previous journey she had made along that same road. She had spent years steeling herself for exactly this kind of choice, rehearsing arguments for why the secret needed to remain buried forever, and yet now, having finally asked her brother what he wanted rather than simply deciding for him, the fear that had gripped her for so long felt smaller than it once had, though it had not entirely disappeared. She arrived at Camden Hall well after dark, the house quiet except for a single light burning in Julian's study window. She found him there, exactly where she expected, a stack of papers before him that he was clearly not reading, his attention instead fixed on the door, as though he had been listening for the sound of her carriage for hours. "You're back," he said, rising immediately from his desk. "I wasn't certain you would return tonight, given the hour." "I told you I would," Eleanor said simply, and something in her tone, calmer and more certain than it had been in days, seemed to reach him. She sat down across from him without waiting to be invited, folding her hands carefully in her lap, and took a slow breath before beginning. "I made a promise to my mother, on her deathbed, when I was 16 years old and my brother was 12. She had spent years hiding him from the world, ashamed of a condition she never fully understood, and terrified of what people would say if they knew the truth. She made me swear I would keep him safe, keep him hidden from judgment, and never let anyone lock him away in the kind of institution that treated people like him as burdens to be managed, rather than people to be loved." Julian sat very still, listening, though Eleanor could see the effort it cost him not to interrupt with questions. "His name is Edwin," she continued. "He is my younger brother, and he has lived at Dr. Cole's home for the past 6 years, cared for with more patience and understanding than our own mother, in her grief and fear, ever managed to offer him. I have spent every spare shilling I earned as a seamstress ensuring he had that care, and when you offered me this marriage, Your Grace, I will admit freely that the money mattered to me, but not for silk dresses or grand houses. It mattered because it meant I could finally stop worrying whether I would earn enough each month to keep my brother safe and cared for the way he deserves." She paused, watching Julian's face carefully, searching for the judgment she had spent years dreading, the recoil she had convinced herself any respectable man would show upon learning such a truth. Instead, she found something else entirely, something that looked, if she dared to name it, almost like shame. "I accused you of an affair," Julian said quietly, the words landing heavily in the space between them. "I let my cousin's suggestions and my own family's history poison every reasonable thought I might have had, and the entire time, you were protecting nothing more than your brother's dignity and a promise you made to your dying mother." "You couldn't have known," Eleanor said, though there was little forgiveness yet in her tone, the wound from his suspicions still too fresh to fully set aside.
"I could have asked,"
Julian said. "Honestly, and without suspicion, the very first evening I noticed those letters, rather than assuming the worst and letting my own fears dictate how I treated you. I am sorry, Eleanor. Truly sorry. In a way I don't think I have ever apologized to anyone before." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, weighing the sincerity in his voice against the hurt still sitting heavy in her chest. "I would like you to meet him," she said finally. "Not tonight, not even this week necessarily, but when you're ready, I would like you to meet my brother and see for yourself the person I've spent my whole life protecting. I think you'll find there's very little to be ashamed of, and a great deal to admire." "I would like that very much," Julian said, and for the first time since their wedding day, he meant every word of it without reservation. The visit was arranged for the following fortnight, giving Eleanor time to write to Edwin and prepare him for the idea of meeting her husband, and giving Julian time, though he did not fully realize it, to sit with the discomfort of his own past behavior and decide what kind of man he actually wanted to be going forward. He spent those 2 weeks differently than he had spent any period since inheriting his title. Rather than burying himself entirely in estate business, he made a point of seeking Eleanor out each evening, asking about her day, listening, more than he spoke, slowly rebuilding something he had nearly destroyed through his own suspicion. He did not rush her forgiveness, understanding instinctively that trust, once damaged, could not simply be commanded back into existence through apology alone. It had to be earned again, patiently, through consistent, unremarkable kindness, repeated until it became believable. Margaret Doyle noticed the change and said nothing, though the warmth in her expression whenever she observed the two of them together spoke plainly enough of her approval. Charles Vane noticed the change as well, and liked it considerably less than Margaret did. He had spent weeks carefully cultivating suspicion between Julian and his new wife, hoping to either drive them apart entirely or, at minimum, to keep Julian too distracted and unsettled to focus properly on the estate's recovery, leaving Charles himself more room to influence decisions that might eventually benefit his own position within the family. Watching that careful work unravel in a matter of days left him frustrated, and frustration, in a man like Charles, rarely stayed passive for long. He made his own inquiries again, more aggressive this time, and it did not take long before he learned the full truth Eleanor had only recently shared with her husband. A brother, hidden away for years, cared for at a private residence for individuals with conditions polite society preferred not to discuss. It was, Charles recognized immediately, a scandal with genuine teeth, exactly the kind of revelation that could unravel a fragile new duke's careful reputation if released to the wrong ears at the wrong moment. He said nothing to Julian directly, choosing instead to wait, watching for the perfect opportunity to use what he had learned. That opportunity arrived in the form of a grand gathering hosted by Julian's own mother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice Ashford, intended to formally introduce Eleanor to the wider family and to the circle of influential families whose good opinion mattered a great deal to the Ashford name's continued recovery from scandal. It was to be Eleanor's first true test as Duchess, an evening of careful conversation and careful scrutiny from people who had spent months whispering about the mysterious seamstress who had somehow captured a duke's hand. Julian and Eleanor traveled to meet Edwin 3 days before the gathering, and the visit went better than either of them had truly dared to hope. Edwin greeted Julian with the same open, unguarded warmth he showed everyone he liked, immediately eager to show him the garden he had spent so many hours tending. And Julian, to his own quiet surprise, found himself genuinely charmed rather than uncomfortable, drawn in by Edwin's straightforward honesty in a way that felt like a relief after months of navigating a family full of careful, calculated speech. "You're taller than I expected," Edwin informed him seriously, studying Julian with open curiosity. "Ellie said you were a duke. I thought dukes would be older." I inherited rather suddenly, Julian said, unable to suppress a small smile at the boy's directness. I'm still getting used to it myself, if I'm honest. Edwin nodded thoughtfully, as though this were a perfectly reasonable explanation, and led him toward the carrots with obvious pride, explaining in careful detail exactly how long each row had taken to grow, and which vegetables required the most patience. Eleanor watched the two of them together with something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest, an emotion she had not allowed herself to name yet, though it felt dangerously close to hope. He's remarkable, Julian said quietly, as they walked back toward the carriage at the end of the visit, Edwin waving cheerfully from the garden gate until they were entirely out of sight. I confess I don't fully understand why anyone would want to hide him away, as though there were something shameful in who he is. Most people don't take the time to understand him the way you just did, Eleanor said. They see only what makes him different, and decide that difference is something to be feared, or pitied, rather than simply accepted. Then those people are fools, Julian said firmly, and Eleanor felt, for the first time since her mother's death, the smallest loosening of a fear she had carried for years, the fear that the world would only ever see her brother as a burden, rather than a person worth knowing. But the peace of that visit did not last long. 2 evenings later, on the night of the Dowager Duchess's grand gathering, Charles Vane made his move. The evening had begun well enough, the great hall of the Dowager's London townhouse filled with careful, glittering conversation, Eleanor navigating introductions with more grace than even she had expected of herself. Julian stayed close beside her throughout the evening, a steady, quiet presence that helped ease the worst of her nerves, and for a while, it seemed the evening might pass without incident. Then Charles found his moment, waiting until a particularly influential circle of guests had gathered near the refreshment table, close enough that his voice, pitched carefully to carry just far enough, would not go unheard. I do wonder, he said, addressing the group with practiced casualness, whether our new Duchess has told anyone of her family's more unusual circumstances. A younger brother, kept hidden away at a private residence for individuals with certain unfortunate conditions. Rather curious that such a detail never came up during the wedding preparations, wouldn't you agree? The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of shocked murmurs spreading outward through the gathered guests almost immediately. Eleanor felt the color drain from her face, every carefully rehearsed poise she had built over the evening, threatening to collapse entirely under the weight of dozens of curious, judgmental eyes, suddenly turning her way. Julian, however, did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden hush that had fallen over the room, steady and utterly without shame. My wife's brother is a kind, thoughtful young man who spends his days tending a garden with more care and patience than most men I know manage in any part of their lives. I have met him myself, and I found him a great deal more honest company than most of the people currently standing in this room. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd, several guests exchanging startled glances at the directness of the Duke's response. You'll forgive me, cousin, Julian continued, turning to face Charles directly now, his voice cooling into something harder, if I fail to see the scandal in a family caring for one of its own, with compassion, rather than shame. If anything, I find myself questioning the character of a man who would use another person's private family circumstances as a weapon at a social gathering, purely to satisfy his own grievances. Charles's easy smile faltered for the first time since Julian had known him, clearly having expected a very different reaction, perhaps hoping to watch his cousin scramble to distance himself from the embarrassment, rather than defend it outright in front of half the family's most influential connections. I meant no harm by it, Charles said stiffly, though the room's shifting mood made clear that his attempt had backfired badly. Merely curiosity, cousin, nothing more. Then in future, keep your curiosity to yourself, Julian said evenly, particularly where my family is concerned. He turned back to Eleanor then, offering his arm with quiet, unwavering steadiness, and led her through the room, past the murmuring guests, with his head held high, and no trace of apology in his expression. Eleanor walked beside him, her own composure slowly returning as she registered, gradually, that he had not flinched, had not hesitated, had defended her and her brother without a single moment of the doubt that had colored his behavior only weeks earlier. Thank you, she said quietly, once they had found a quieter corner of the room, away from the worst of the lingering stares. You needn't thank me, Julian said, echoing, without quite realizing it, the exact words she had spoken to him weeks before, on the night of the servant boy's fever. I meant every word of it. Eleanor looked up at him, and for the first time since their wedding day, something in her expression softened into something that looked almost like affection, unguarded and entirely genuine. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am beginning to understand why my mother always believed love could exist, even in the most unlikely arrangements. I did not expect to find it here. Not with you, not so soon, but I find myself grateful, all the same, that I did." Julian, who had spent months convincing himself he no longer believed in such feelings at all, found he had no ready response to that, beyond the sudden, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his own chest, and the quiet certainty, settling in for the first time, that whatever this marriage had begun as, it had become something else entirely. News of the confrontation at the Dowager Duchess's gathering spread quickly through London's drawing rooms in the days that followed, though not in the direction Charles Vane had hoped. Rather than casting Eleanor as an object of scandal, the story that circulated painted Julian as a devoted husband, fiercely loyal to his family, and Eleanor as a woman of quiet, admirable strength, who had spent years caring for a brother most of society would have simply hidden away out of shame. Several of the older, more respected families, the very ones whose good opinion Julian had worked so hard to secure since inheriting his title, sent notes of quiet approval, some even requesting the pleasure of meeting young Edwin themselves, curious rather than judgmental. Charles found himself, for the first time in years, on the wrong side of the family's favor. His mother, embarrassed by her son's public misstep, kept him at arm's length for weeks afterward, and even the Dowager Duchess, who had never much cared for her late husband's nephew, made her disapproval known in the careful, cutting way only a woman of her position could manage, without ever raising her voice. Julian, for his part, did not gloat over his cousin's fall from favor, though he made certain, in the weeks that followed, to distance the estate's most sensitive financial dealings from Charles's involvement entirely. It was not vengeance, he told himself, so much as simple prudence. A man who would weaponize a private family matter for his own advantage could not be trusted with anything more important than idle conversation. At Camden Hall, the household settled into a new rhythm, entirely different from the cold, careful distance of the earliest months. Julian began joining Eleanor on her monthly visits to see Edwin, and slowly, the visits stopped feeling like a secret obligation carried out of duty and became something both of them genuinely looked forward to, an escape from the pressures of estate business and society's watchful eyes. Edwin, for his part, took an immediate and lasting liking to Julian, greeting him each visit with the same enthusiastic warmth he had shown from the very first meeting, and Julian found himself, more often than he expected, seeking Edwin's straightforward perspective on matters that had grown too tangled and political within his own family circle to think through clearly. "You worry too much about what people think," Edwin told him once, during a quiet afternoon spent weeding the garden together while Eleanor sat nearby reading. "Ellie used to worry about that too, before. I think you're helping her worry less now." Julian paused his work, considering the observation with more seriousness than the boy likely realized he deserved. "I think you might be right," he admitted, "though I suspect she's helped me worry less as well, in her own way." Edwin nodded, satisfied, and returned his attention to the stubborn weed he had been working to remove, and Julian found himself smiling at the simple wisdom of it, unburdened by the careful political calculations that colored nearly every other conversation he had grown accustomed to since becoming a duke. Back at Camden Hall, Eleanor noticed the change in her husband as clearly as he had once noticed the change in her. He no longer disappeared into his study each evening, choosing instead to seek her out, sometimes simply to sit together in comfortable silence, sometimes to talk through the small, unremarkable details of their days that had never seemed worth sharing before. Slowly, carefully, the careful walls both of them had built, Eleanor out of years of guarding her family's secret, Julian, out of years of guarding himself against his own family's betrayals, began to come down. It was not always easy. Old habits of self-protection did not disappear overnight, simply because trust had begun, however tentatively, to take root. There were still evenings when Eleanor caught herself holding back a worry rather than voicing it, still moments when Julian's old instinct toward suspicion flared briefly before he consciously set it aside. But each time, they found their way back to honesty, a little faster than before, the distance between them shrinking, with each small, deliberate act of trust. One evening, several weeks after the confrontation with Charles, Julian found Eleanor in the garden at Camden Hall, tending a small patch of vegetables she had recently planted near the kitchen entrance. Inspired, she admitted with a small laugh, by watching Edwin's careful devotion to his own garden. "I never took you for someone who enjoyed getting her hands dirty," Julian said, settling onto the bench beside her. "There's a great deal about me you're still learning, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though the teasing warmth in her voice had replaced the wary formality that once colored every exchange between them. "I find I don't mind the learning," Julian said, watching her work with quiet fondness. "In fact, I think it might be my favorite part of this arrangement, if I'm honest." Eleanor looked up at him then, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of one dirt-streaked hand. "You once told me you would not pretend to feelings you did not have," she said. "I remember it clearly. From the carriage ride to Camden Hall on our wedding day. I remember it too," Julian admitted, a note of something like regret coloring his voice. "I meant it at the time. I had convinced myself, after everything my brother put this family through, that feelings only ever led to disappointment, and I thought it safer, simpler, to build a marriage on practical arrangement alone, rather than risk that kind of vulnerability again." "And now?" Eleanor asked, setting down her small garden trowel and giving him her full attention. Julian took her hand, careful and deliberate, the dirt from her fingers smudging against his own, without either of them minding in the slightest. "Now I find myself grateful, every single day, that a stranger's practical arrangement somehow became the truest, most honest relationship I have ever known. You never once asked me to be anyone other than who I am, Eleanor, not even when I gave you every reason to expect disappointment from me. I would like, if you'll allow it, to spend the rest of our marriage earning the kind of trust I so nearly threw away through my own foolish suspicion." Eleanor's eyes glistened, though her smile remained steady, unwavering. "I think," she said softly, "that you've already begun earning it. Every visit to see Edwin, every evening, you've chosen to sit with me, instead of retreating to your study. Every time you've defended us both, without a moment's hesitation, even when it cost you socially. I don't think trust is something earned all at once, Julian. I think it's something built, quietly, day after day, the same way I built the promise I made to my mother all those years ago. And I think, somewhere in these past weeks, you've built quite a bit of it already." It was the first time she had called him, simply by his given name, without the formal title she had used so carefully since their wedding day, and something about the simple intimacy of it settled deep in Julian's chest, warmer and more meaningful than any grand declaration might have managed. "Then let me continue building it," he said quietly, "for as long as you'll let me." Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since accepting his cold, practical proposal all those months ago, she allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that the marriage she had entered out of desperate necessity had grown into something she would have chosen freely, had circumstance ever given her the choice from the very beginning. Neither of them noticed the quiet approval in Margaret Doyle's expression as she watched from a nearby window, nor did they know that within the household, whispers of the young Duke and Duchess's genuine devotion to one another had already begun to replace the old rumors of a cold, calculated arrangement entirely. What had begun as a transaction between two wounded strangers had become, slowly and carefully, exactly the kind of partnership neither of them had believed themselves capable of building again. Winter settled over Camden Hall with a quiet that felt, for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, entirely peaceful rather than lonely. Snow gathered along the estate's long drive, and the household moved through its days with the easy rhythm of a home that had finally found its footing, the earlier tension between its master and mistress replaced by something steady and warm that even the newest servants could sense within days of joining the staff. But Charles Vane had not entirely given up. Stripped of his cousin's trust and much of the family's remaining goodwill, he had grown increasingly desperate over the preceding weeks, watching what little influence he once held over the estate's affairs shrink with each passing month. Deep in debts of his own, ones he had kept carefully hidden from the rest of the family, he made one final, reckless attempt to secure his position before his creditors' patience ran out entirely. It began with a forged letter, painstakingly constructed to suggest that Julian's late brother had fathered a child before his death, a child whose existence, if proven, would throw the entire line of inheritance into legal chaos and, Charles calculated, force a costly, prolonged dispute that he believed he could maneuver to his own advantage, positioning himself as the family's only steady hand during the resulting confusion. The letter arrived at the offices of the family's solicitors on a cold morning in early December, accompanied by a claim from a woman none of them had ever heard of, demanding recognition and financial support for a son she insisted was the rightful heir to the Ashford line. Julian received word of the claim with the particular calm that had become characteristic of him since his marriage, no longer the volatile, easily suspicious man who had once let a locked box of letters convince him of his own wife's betrayal. Instead of panicking, he called immediately for Eleanor, laying the entire matter before her with the same honesty he had promised himself, months earlier, that he would always offer her going forward. "Something about this feels wrong," Eleanor said, studying the copies of the letter and the woman's claim that Julian had brought home from his solicitor's offices. "The timing is too convenient, arriving exactly when your cousin's own finances have grown so precarious. Has anyone verified this woman's account beyond her own word?" "Not yet," Julian admitted. "The solicitors are treating it seriously, given the potential consequences, but nothing has been confirmed." "Then let us confirm it ourselves," Eleanor said, with a decisiveness that made Julian smile despite the seriousness of the situation. "Before this claim has the chance to spread through every drawing room in London and undo everything you've worked to rebuild." Together, they began their own quiet investigation, working alongside the family's solicitors rather than simply waiting anxiously for updates. Eleanor, drawing on skills sharpened by years of managing careful household accounts on almost no money at all, noticed a discrepancy in the dates on the forged letter, almost immediately. A reference to an event that, according to the family's own records, had occurred nearly a year after the claimed circumstances would have allowed. "This is fabricated," she said, showing Julian the inconsistency. "Whoever constructed this claim was careless, or perhaps simply desperate enough not to check their own details carefully." Armed with the discrepancy, Julian's solicitors moved quickly to unravel the rest of the woman's story, eventually tracing payment for her cooperation back to an account Charles Vane had opened under a false name, one he had used to funnel funds meant to disguise his own hand in the entire scheme. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place not in a public drawing room this time, but in the private study at Camden Hall, where Julian summoned his cousin Alon, Eleanor seated quietly beside him, her presence a deliberate choice, a demonstration of exactly the partnership Charles had once tried so hard to undermine. "You forged a claim against your own family's inheritance," Julian said, laying the evidence out plainly on the desk between them, his voice controlled but unmistakably furious beneath the surface calm. "Fabricated a child, paid a stranger to lie under oath if necessary, all to protect yourself from debts you were too proud to admit to anyone who might have actually helped you manage them honestly." Charles's carefully maintained composure finally cracked entirely, the easy smile gone, replaced by something closer to panic. "You don't understand the position I've been placed in," he said. "Watching you inherit everything I spent years preparing myself to manage responsibly, while you nearly threw it all away on suspicion and scandal, before finally settling into some ridiculous devotion to a seamstress and her." He stopped himself, but not soon enough. "Finish that sentence," Julian said quietly, "and you will regret it far more than you already regret whatever debts drove you to this scheme in the first place." Charles said nothing further, the fight visibly draining out of him as he registered, at last, the full weight of what he had lost. Not just his cousin's trust, long since forfeited, but any remaining claim to the family's protection or support, should his creditors come calling in earnest. "I will not have you arrested," Julian said finally, after a long, heavy silence. "Not for my own sake, but because I have no wish to drag this family through further scandal than you have already risked causing. But you will leave England, Charles, and you will not return while I hold this title. Whatever debts you carry, you will settle them on your own, without further access to funds or influence from this family. And should I ever learn you have attempted anything of this sort again, against my wife, against her brother, against anyone under my protection, I promise you the consequences will be far less forgiving than what I am offering you today." Charles left Camden Hall within the week, and though rumors of his departure circulated for a time among London's more curious circles, the truth of his forged claim never fully spread beyond the small circle who had helped uncover it, sparing the family further scandal, while ensuring Charles himself would never again hold influence over the Ashford estate. With the threat finally resolved, Julian and Eleanor found themselves, for the first time since their wedding, entirely free of the shadows that had followed their marriage from its very beginning. The following spring, they made a decision that would once have seemed unthinkable to the cautious, guarded woman Eleanor had been on her wedding day. With Dr. Cole's guidance and Edwin's own enthusiastic agreement, they arranged for a smaller, more independent residence to be built on Camden Hall's own grounds, close enough that Edwin could visit as often as he liked, tend his own garden within sight of his sister's home, and slowly, carefully, become part of the wider world he had told Eleanor, months earlier, that he wished to know better. The transition was not instantaneous, nor without its own careful challenges, but Edwin thrived in ways that surprised even Dr. Cole, who visited regularly to ensure the arrangement continued to serve him well. He became a familiar, beloved figure among the Camden Hall staff, his garden expanding each season, his easy warmth winning over even those who had once whispered doubts about the family's willingness to embrace him so openly. By the following autumn, when the Dowager Duchess hosted another grand gathering, this time to celebrate the announcement of Eleanor's first pregnancy, Edwin attended as an honored guest rather than a hidden secret, greeting the family's assembled friends and relations with the same open, unguarded warmth he had always shown, and finding, to Eleanor's quiet, overwhelming joy, that most of them received him with genuine kindness rather than the judgment she had spent so many years dreading. Julian stood beside her throughout the evening, his hand resting warm and steady over hers, and as she watched her brother laugh easily with a small group of curious young cousins eager to hear about his garden, Eleanor felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at peace. "You once believed I married you for nothing more than your title," she said quietly to Julian, as the evening wound toward its close. "I did," Julian admitted, without a trace of the old defensiveness that might once have colored such an admission. "And I have never been more grateful to have been so entirely, wonderfully wrong." Eleanor smiled, leaning into him, watching her brother's easy laughter carry across the crowded room, watching the family she had once been so certain would judge him, instead welcome him with open arms. The promise she had made to her mother all those years ago, whispered through tears at a deathbed neither of them had wanted to face, had never once been broken. But somewhere along the difficult, uncertain path of her marriage, that promise had transformed from a burden carried alone into a joy shared freely, with a husband who had learned, in the end, that the truest measure of love was not grand declarations or careful arrangements, but the quiet, steady choice to stand beside someone and the family they cherished, no matter what the world might think. And as the first snow of a new winter began to fall gently over Camden Hall's familiar gardens, Julian Ashford understood, more clearly than he ever had, that the woman he had once married for practical convenience had given him something he had long ago stopped believing he deserved, a home built not on arrangement, but on trust, patience, and a love that had grown strong enough to weather every storm either of them had ever faced. 5 years passed, and Camden Hall had changed in ways neither Julian nor Eleanor could have predicted on that cold, uncertain night of their first meeting. The nursery, once a quiet, unused room at the end of the east wing, now rang with the laughter of 2 children, a daughter named Charlotte, quick-witted and endlessly curious, and a younger son named Henry, who had inherited his Uncle Edwin's gentle patience, along with his father's steady calm. Eleanor's own father, whose failing health had first brought Julian to her door all those years before, had recovered fully under the care his son-in-law's fortune had made possible, and though age had slowed him considerably, he had lived long enough to see both his grandchildren born, spending his final years in a small cottage on the Camden estate itself, close enough to visit whenever he pleased, finally free of the exhausting worry that had defined so much of his daughter's early life. When he passed peacefully in his sleep one quiet autumn evening, surrounded by family rather than isolated in the cramped rooms above the bakery where Eleanor had spent her girlhood, she grieved deeply, but without the guilt that might once have accompanied such a loss. She had kept every promise she made to protect the people she loved, and her father had known, in his final years, exactly how loved he truly was. Edwin, now approaching 30, had grown into a life of his own, one that would have seemed impossible to imagine in the anxious early days when Eleanor had guarded his existence as though it were the most fragile secret in the world. His garden at Camden Hall had expanded into a small, thriving operation that supplied vegetables not only to the estate's own kitchens, but to several neighboring households as well. And Edwin, with quiet pride, managed the accounts himself, having spent years patiently learning arithmetic, with Dr. Cole's continued guidance, until the numbers no longer confused him the way they once had. He had also, to Eleanor's quiet delight, found companionship of his own. A young woman named Beatrice Langley, the daughter of a local farmer who supplied seed and tools to Edwin's garden, had taken a liking to his straightforward honesty and gentle humor from their very first meeting, and over the following 2 years, a careful, unhurried courtship had blossomed into something neither of them had expected, but both had come to treasure. Beatrice, who had grown up with a younger brother of her own, who required particular patience and understanding, never once treated Edwin as anything other than exactly who he was, and the ease between them reminded Eleanor, more than once, of the ease she had come to share with Julian himself. Their wedding took place in the small chapel at Camden Hall on a bright spring morning, with Julian standing proudly beside Edwin as his witness, an honor Edwin had requested himself, and Eleanor watching from the front pew with tears she made no effort to hide. She thought, as she watched her brother exchange vows with a woman who loved him exactly as he was, of the promise she had made at her mother's bedside so many years before, and understood, fully and completely, that she had not merely kept that promise. She had helped it grow into something far larger and more beautiful than her grieving, frightened mother could ever have imagined possible. Julian, for his part, had grown into his role as Duke with a steadiness that surprised even the family's most skeptical older relations, who had once doubted whether a second son thrust so suddenly into responsibility could ever manage the position with the grace his late brother had so thoroughly lacked. He proved himself, year after year, a fair and thoughtful landlord to the estate's tenants, a generous patron to causes that mattered to him, and most of all, a devoted husband and father, whose transformation from the cold, guarded man who had once proposed marriage as a business arrangement was spoken of, quietly and admiringly, throughout the county. He never forgot the lesson his own suspicion had nearly cost him, and he made a point, in the years that followed, of extending to his own children the kind of open trust he had so nearly failed to offer his wife. When young Henry, at the age of 4, showed a slower pace of learning than his older sister, struggling where Charlotte had raced ahead, Julian felt none of the old family shame that had once driven his own mother-in-law to hide her son away entirely. Instead, he and Eleanor sought out patient tutors, celebrated every small victory alongside the larger ones, and made certain their son understood, from his very earliest years, that he was loved exactly as he was, without condition or comparison. "You've given him something neither of us had growing up," Eleanor said one evening, watching Julian help Henry sound out letters at the kitchen table with endless, unhurried patience. "A family that doesn't require him to be anyone other than himself to earn its love." "I learned that from you," Julian said simply, looking up at her with the same steady warmth that had become as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. "Every lesson in this family, about love without condition, I learned by watching you fight for your brother's dignity, long before I deserved to understand why it mattered so much." Camden Hall, once a house of cold, echoing silence and careful guarded distance, had become instead a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the easy comfort of people who had learned, through difficult experience, exactly how much strength quiet love could carry. Margaret Doyle, still faithfully serving as housekeeper, though age had begun to slow her steps, often remarked to the younger staff that she had never seen a household transform so completely, nor a marriage grow from such uncertain beginnings into something so genuinely, unmistakably happy. Charles Vane's fate remained, for the most part, a distant memory rarely discussed within the family. Word occasionally reached them of his difficult circumstances abroad, debts still following him despite his attempts to outrun them, but Julian never wasted much thought on his cousin's continued struggles, having long since made peace with the entire episode as simply the final, difficult lesson he needed to learn before he could fully become the husband and father his family deserved. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Julian and Eleanor walked together through the same gardens where he had first begun to notice, all those years ago, that his quiet, guarded wife carried far more depth and strength than his early suspicions had ever allowed him to see. Charlotte and Henry ran ahead of them, chasing something only children could find fascinating enough to chase, and Edwin and Beatrice's own small cottage stood visible in the distance, smoke curling gently from its chimney into the cool evening air. "Do you ever think of that first evening?" Eleanor asked, "when you arrived at my door with nothing more than a practical proposal and an expectation of discretion?" "Often," Julian admitted, taking her hand as they walked. "I think of the man I was that evening, so certain that feelings only ever led to disappointment, so determined to protect myself from ever being made a fool of again. I hardly recognize him now, honestly. I'm grateful, every single day, that you agreed to marry someone so thoroughly convinced he knew exactly what he wanted, only to discover he had no idea at all." Eleanor smiled, leaning against his shoulder as they walked, the golden light of early evening settling warm and gentle over the estate that had become, against every expectation either of them once carried, a true and lasting home. "I think," she said softly, "that we both discovered something neither of us expected to find. Not a practical arrangement, not a business transaction settled for the sake of convenience, but a family built on honesty, patience, and the kind of love that doesn't require anyone to hide who they truly are, in order to be worthy of it." Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, cupping her face gently in his hands, the same hands that had once signed a cold, contractual proposal, without ever imagining the life it would eventually grow into. "I love you," he said simply, the words no longer difficult or unfamiliar the way they might once have been, but easy now, worn smooth by years of daily practice. "Not for the promise you kept, though I admire that more than I could ever fully express. Not for the family you gave me, though I treasure every part of it. I love you simply because of who you are, and I will spend every remaining year of my life grateful that a cold winter proposal became the truest, most honest thing I have ever built." Eleanor kissed him gently, the warmth of the setting sun and the sound of their children's distant laughter wrapping around them both, and understood, with complete and settled certainty, that whatever uncertain beginning had once brought them together, the life they had built since then belonged entirely, unmistakably, to them, and to the promise, kept faithfully and openly at last, that had shaped every part of their journey toward it.